Mage Storytime, Episode 15, Rescue Mission, Part 1. This is the continuing story of the Iron Goldfish, a party of role-players who awakened as mages. Our cast includes Alwi, who manipulates time with his phone; Bard, a mind and spirit mage who uses superheroes as his gods; Critical, who improves the luck of others through his own pain; Handy, a correspondence-using thief who steals items at long range; Kitty, who empowers his stickers and cats with spirits; Talo, a postmodern mage who uses a hodgepodge of skills to manipulate forces and matter; and Weeb, who uses his life skills to enhance his martial arts and Chinese medicine. Somewhat less than a week had passed when several members of our party met up again. Having escaped from the lands of the dead, most of us were exhausted, both mentally and physically, and slept like logs for the next few nights. Alwi, Kitty, and Handy were not so lucky. They had trouble sleeping for several days, but it wasn't until the weekend when they figured out why. Alwi, who lived with his younger brother Kitty, was sleeping fitfully in his room when he turned over and noticed the teddy bear he had acquired in the Shadowlands glowing. Then he noticed the small child standing in his room. He didn't shriek like a little girl, but only because his mouth was suddenly too dry to make much sound. The strange child, who had apparently broken into his house in the middle of the night, asked, "Have you seen my daddy?" "Why, no, small child, I haven't seen your daddy. Why are you in my room looking for him?" "I don't know. I dropped Mr. Teddy and came to find him. But I can't find my daddy now." With this, the child started to wail. "Please don't cry. I'll help you find your daddy. When's the last time you remember seeing him?" "He tucked me and Mr. Teddy in. Then there was a lot of smoke and fire. And then I don't know." This reinforced Always' suspicions, indicating that he was not the victim of a toddler home invader, but rather that he was being haunted by a child's ghost. That theory would also explain why he could see through it. His first thought was to go to a church to get it exorcised. Taking the spectral child by the hand, Alwi jumped in his car and drove to the nearest church. He was in Texas, so he didn't have to drive far. When he got there, he was surprised to find the doors locked. Then he remembered that it was 3 a.m. And then he remembered that his brother, who slept only a few feet down the hall, worked with a psychopomp and could probably resolve his ghost problem. He broke a number of traffic ordinances in his race home. Stomping into their shared apartment, Alwi paused only long enough to fill a glass with ice water. Then, small ghost in tow, he burst into Kitty's room and shouted, "Wake up and call the guy!" A sleepy, "What?" was the only response he got. He splashed the frigid water into his brother's face, dousing him and the bed. "Wake up and call the guy!" When all he received was another, "What?" amidst a string of curses and death threats, he reached out and slapped his brother. He grabbed him by the shirt collar, gestured at the ghost's waif, and shouted, "Wake up and call the guy!" It took a few more moments of shaking for Kitty's sleep-addled brain to put two and two together and identify the ghost in the room. Then he realized that his incoherent brother wanted him to call Baron Samedi. He pulled a business card out of his wallet. He had a bunch printed with the Baron's sigil to save time drawing, and slipped it into the jar of grave dirt. Then he proceeded to have a loud and abusive argument with his brother about the proper way to wake someone and the inadequate response times of sleepy people. The child just stood and stared. About that time, a spectral voice came floating into the room, demanding that someone give it back. It was followed by a spectral woman in a waterlogged wedding dress. She floated into the room, glaring at the two mages. They stared at her for a moment, then turned and resumed their argument. The brothers shouted at one another over the irate ghost's cries for another few minutes, until a deep and resonating voice spoke from the ether and said, "What's all this, then?" The bedroom got a little smaller as Baron Samedi's large, though not inhuman, frame entered through a wall. Alwi and Kitty just pointed at the ghosts, and the Baron laughed. "Well, what did you expect when you took their fetters from the underworld? Wraiths are obsessive creatures, and are not quick to forget the meaningful things of their life." When Kitty looked confused, The large Loa pointed to the engagement ring that Kitty had pocketed while in the lands of the dead. It was glowing faintly. Alwi asked what that was all about, and was informed that the items were laden with emotions and memories. They formed powerful attachments for spirits, but that same potency could make them excellent weapons when wielded against ghosts. At that last part, Alwi perked up. He asked if there was any way he could keep the spirit-smiting teddy bear without remaining haunted by a small child. The Baron helpfully informed him that it could be done, but that it would mean separating the wraith from its attachments and sending it to oblivion. When Alwi asked what that was, the Baron said, "People disagree. Some, like the Euthanatos, argue that it is the end through which souls must pass so that they can re-enter the cycle of death and rebirth. The wraiths themselves say that it is final destruction, hence the name Oblivion. Some also say it's related to the abyss, where demons and devils reside, or to the worm. I don't know, I've never been there myself." After hearing this, Alwi paced over to a corner and started to ponder. Should he send a child's soul to what might be hell in exchange for a weapon? It was a serious conundrum and required serious thought. Or at least it did for Alwi. The rest of us, when we heard the story from Kitty later, suggested that he had forgot to get his soul back from the cleaners. Or maybe he was just extra cranky from being woken up. Eventually, Alwi's conscience, small though that might be, won out, and he decided to spare the child. Plus, he asked the Baron about the fetters and found out they weren't that powerful as weapons. Kitty didn't have the same issue, being the superior brother, and gave Baron Samedi the ring for him to return to the Shadowlands without hesitation. He could have just given it back to the spirit, the Baron said, but since he was there and it was technically his job, the large black god said he would re-escort these souls to the underworld. He took the lady by the hand, lovingly bundled the small child into his other arm, and, with a judging look at Alwi, faded from sight. It was just as he fully faded that a small portal appeared in the wall, and Handy poked his head through. "Hey guys, can you help me with this ghost?" Like Alwi and Kitty, Handy had taken an artifact from the spirit world, a pair of replica dueling pistols. Like the other two, he had been having sleepless nights, until that weekend when he was visited by a man with long white hair, a waxed white mustache and goatee, and gray Mage's uniform from the American Civil War. When he spoke, his southern accent was as thick as molasses. "Sir! I say, sir! You must return my property immediately, sir!" It took Handy a few minutes to wake up enough to respond, and when he did, his first thoughts were of fried chicken. He asked if the man was the ghost of a Kentucky colonel, and that set the spirit off. "Sir, any fool can see from my uniform that I hold a major's rank, and hail from the great state of Alabama. Now return my property at once, sir, or I shall be forced to resort to violence." At that, Handy decided he was done. He remembered that Kitty had made friends with the god of the dead, or something like that. He didn't have a background in comparative religions, so he was a bit hazy on the Baron. Using a new trick he had learned with correspondence, he opened a small portal to Kitty's bedroom and stuck his head through. He was pleased to find both of the brothers awake and asked, "Hey guys, can you help me with this ghost?" "Sure, what the hell, come on through." Handy enlarged the hole and stepped bodily into Kitty's bedroom, followed by the Confederate Major. Introductions were made, and when the issue of the ghost property came up, Handy produced the replica dueling pistols for inspection. Alwi decided that the pistols looked like better weapons than the teddy bear had. Plus, because of his rude awakening, he was in the mood to hurt someone. So he turned to the ghost and, looking for a justification, asked, "Hey, did you own any slaves?" That is, my uniform may have led you to certain apprehensions. You see, sir, the truth is I was born in 1965. I was a dedicated Civil War reenactor, and one night after an engagement I caroused a little too hard and fell off a bridge. When I arrived in the spectral regions, I was clad just as I had been when I died. But I dearly treasure the replica pistols I carried in my roll. They don't actually fire, they just bring me such pleasant memories. I would very much like them returned, sir. I don't think that's an unreasonable request." Deeply disappointed that he didn't get to beat up any slaveholders, and that the guns weren't real, a disgusted Alwi just shrugged and went back to bed. Kitty indicated that giving the spirit his fetter back would make him go away, and Handy, treasuring his sleep more than the potential weapons, returned them. The reenactor's ghost departed, and Handy went back home. While the ghostly visitations hadn't been much more than an annoyance, they did prompt the 3 team members to lobby for finding the Dream Speakers soon, as they were supposed to deal with the spirit world, and we could apparently use help in that department. Fortunately, Kitty's friends in the Voodoo Gangstas knew a few of the Dream Speakers and gave us their contact info. Apparently, the 2 known members in town both worked at a prominent local university, a Dr. Laughing Dog and a Dr. Wynn. The former was a professor of indigenous studies, and the latter was a visiting professor of anthropology and cultural studies. Tello was the one potentially interested in joining the tradition, although we all wanted to make connections with the powerful spirit mages, so she took point. Also, she had a master's degree in anthropology, so she could make an appointment to meet with Dr. Wynn as a potential PhD student. That would provide us with some cover until we could introduce ourselves as mages. When we arrived at the university and made our way to the anthropology department, we saw the professor right away. He was tall and leanly built, and at first glance we assumed he was African American. Then he opened his mouth, and we immediately readjusted our assumptions. He was neither African nor American. "G'day, mates. Stephen R. Wynn, visiting professor of anthropology and cultural studies. I'll focus on Australian Aborigines, in case that wasn't obvious. And you lot must be the Iron Goldfish, that new group of mages running around making a name for yourselves." We were a bit taken aback, not only because he knew us, but also because he didn't even make a nod towards pretense and subterfuge. So much for subtlety. We were also surprised, albeit not unpleasantly, that people were talking about us. Tello said, yes, that's us. How did you know about us?" "Oh, that. My colleague, Dr. Laughing Dog, shares a mutual friend with you lot, and that guy's a huge fan. Tells Laughing Dog all sorts of crazy stories, and he passes a lot of them on to me." We were silent a few moments as we thought about who the mysterious mutual friend might be, until Bard suddenly went, "Wait, Laughing Dog? Oh, it couldn't be." Well, at least we had apparently found the favor of a trickster god, although if you're familiar with the stories, you know that's not always a good thing. We continued our conversation with the Aussie professor for some time. Tello asked about joining the tradition, and was told the only entry requirement was to establish a relationship with a guardian spirit. It was a simple process, usually just involving a contract and ritual with a willing, hopefully somewhat powerful, spirit. Critical, Bard, and Kitty, the other spirit mages in the party, perked up their ears at that, and asked if anyone could do it, or if it was just a Dream Speaker's thing. We were told that anyone could do it, and the friendly scholar even provided a basic set of instructions for setting up such a thing. The only other incident of note in the meeting was when we mentioned spirit visitations and trouble with the underworld. Dr. Wynn sympathized, and offered to sell us a set of magically infused bracelets made by some mages in his community back home. He said they would act as armor against most spectral attacks. We were quick to buy them up, especially as he wasn't asking too much. Apparently for most people they weren't much more than good luck charms. Making our goodbyes and promising to return once we had established some guardian spirits, we made our way back to the Iron Goldfish shop in the suburban mall. When we got there, we all stopped short in the hallway. Standing outside our door was a technocracy agent, apparently waiting on us to open up. When he saw us, he nodded and started to stroll purposely forward, holding up a white handkerchief he had pulled from a pocket. Our hands went to our collective weapons, but we didn't want to start yet another fight outside of our shop in broad daylight. Unless we had to, at least. "Greetings. I'm Agent Kevin. I hear you reality deviants have been asking about me, so I decided to come in person." That didn't make us relax any, and we all flinched when his hand reached into his jacket pocket, but we breathed a little easier when he pulled out an envelope. "I've come under a flag of truce to offer an official ceasefire. So long as you don't try to spread your deviance and so-called magic, we're willing to tolerate your existence. If you'll do one thing for us." Of course, there was always a catch. When we asked what we needed to do, Kevin simply handed the letter to Weeb. We all read over his shoulder as he opened it, and we saw therein a request for us to launch a rescue mission to retrieve some Void engineers and their ship that had been lost in the Maelstrom. Apparently, since we were the ones to initially inform the technocracy on our return from the Shadowlands, they thought we might be able to save the stranded crew. "Why haven't you guys tried to rescue them?" Weeb asked. "We have. Some ships were destroyed en route by the hazardous environment, and 1 or 2 rescue crews got aboard, but all contact with them was lost, replied Kevin. And we're more expendable than your guys, hence the offer of truce, finished Tello. Exactly. We tried to get the technocracy to return our stolen owlbear as part of the deal, but after it was made clear that that was not an option, we reluctantly agreed to help the innocent agents stranded in a fate worse than death. After Kevin instructed us to make any last-minute preparations we might need, Weeb stepped into our digital store to reactivate the spirit beacon we had made, just in case. Then we piled into the agent's SUV and drove quickly into the technocratic company our vampire allies had informed us about weeks ago. We drove it into an underground parking garage, and from there Kevin led us into the building, through a maze of corridors, down some elevators, through more corridors, and finally to a large hangar, in which sat a small spaceship. It wasn't as massive as the one we had seen in the Maelstrom, but most of the party started getting excited at the prospect of living a staple of science fiction. Agent Kevin introduced us to a swaggering man he identified as the captain. Captain Will T. Dirk, at your service, said the man haltingly. He seemed to have some weird speech impediment, but we tried not to judge. And this is my first officer, Sport. He gestured towards a man standing nearby with chalk-white skin and yellow eyes. When the figure saw us staring, he helpfully informed us that he was a cyborg, a human brain inside a robot body. He also said that his name wasn't Sport, it was Ted, but the captain refused to call him anything but Sport. Apparently that's just what he called his cyborg officers. Did that make him a racist, or just a douchebag? The captain said we would take off as soon as the party boarded, and as we started up the walkway, Kevin said goodbye. You're not coming with us? Weeb asked. Thankfully, no. Neither I nor my clone brothers do a lot with other dimensions or spacecraft. We're fairly strictly terrestrial agents. Hearing this, Weeb stepped up to the technocratic agent, took his face tenderly but firmly in his hands, leaned close, and whispered, Promise you'll wait for me. As Agent Kevin sputtered in outrage and sexual confusion, Weeb raced off with a, "Okay, bye!" And with that, we were off into the otherness of space and alternate dimensions. Or at least that's what the captain informed us was happening. We weren't allowed on the bridge, and the ship didn't have any windows, so although we could feel it moving, we just had to take their word. We spent most of our time trying out the hard spacesuits and plasma guns that Sport/Ted helpfully showed us. The technocracy might think us expendable, but it was more than willing to provide a few small arms in case that changed the odds and saved their people. Our trip to the stranded ship, which we found out was named the Undertaking, was fairly uneventful. We had some turbulence, apparently caused by the maelstrom surrounding us, but we didn't feel much inside the sturdy vessel. We docked with the Undertaking, and as our party suited up and began the walk along the umbilical docking device, we were told that Captain Dirk would decouple and pull away to a safe distance, but that he would only be 5 minutes away once we calmed him. We noted that 5 minutes was a long time if you were being chased by some horrifying monster, but we were told that it was the best he could do. We boarded the drifting vessel, none too reassured by the dark, dank corridors and flickering lights. How do you even get dank in space? As we stood by the prow of the vessel on its bottom level, of 3, we had been given a layout, we looked around, taking in the dark and spooky atmosphere. It was better than being outside in the swirling storm of destruction, but only just. It was as we were getting our bearings and arguing quietly about which course to take, that Critical saw something moving at the far end of the hall. Fortunately, the corridor was a long one, so we weren't in any immediate danger. Also, whatever it was wasn't headed towards us, but ducked into what must have been a room on the side of the corridor. When Critical notified the rest of us that he had seen a thing, we unanimously decided to go the other way. Fortunately, the door near the end of the corridor led into a stairwell that ran through all levels of the vessel. Unfortunately, when we opened the door, we saw the hull had been crushed inwards in the room, wrecking the first floor of the stairs, although the upper flight might still be navigable. Fortunately, we were mages, and little things like massive destruction and damage wouldn't stop us. Our materially focused party members tried to restore the stairs through bending matter, reworking gravity, and rewinding time to before they were damaged. We were starting to make some progress when Bard and Critical, who had stayed on guard, said they saw movement again. This time, Critical was able to see enough of the thing to describe it as chitinous, which is never a word you want to hear on a spaceship. Several of us, drawn by his cry and staring down the hallway, reached out with our mage senses. We could tell there was another life form on the same floor as us, and also that it was definitely not human. Critical also noted that it was moving away from us, toward the far end of the hall. We wondered what was down there, and a quick check of the layout said it was engineering. What happens if the engines are destroyed or messed up by some alien monstrosity? All we asked. Big boom? Andy suggested. At least, that's what happens on TV. We decided that it was enough of a possibility to require our intervention, and so we set off in a group down the hallway, towards the alien horror. Tello informed us that she also thought she felt spirits in some of the rooms that stood off the corridor between us and the monster, so we decided to check those first. None of us had military training, but Weeb at least had some knowledge of military fiction and independent tactical training, so he was put in charge of our field maneuvers. He explained the concept of breach and clear to us, and we did our best to storm into one of the storage rooms after Weeb generated a blinding flash of electricity. Thankfully, nothing was in there to see us make fools of ourselves. The same held true with the next room we cleared, which we did a little more professionally that time. The same could not be said of the third. On the positive side, the creature inside didn't seem overly hostile, even when we blasted into the room. Instead, the lumpen creature turned slowly to stare at us with watery eyes. It looked like nothing quite so much as a large, white dog, except that it had long brown hair on the top of its head, fine and thin, like a child's hair. When we saw its face and heard it plaintively call, Edward? Everyone in the party but Talo, who hadn't seen as much anime as the rest of us, felt a stabbing pain in our souls. We let loose with our plasma guns, intent on destroying the foul spirit that had wrenched that nightmare visage from our collective trauma. Or putting it out of its misery if it was somehow real. Either way, we got rid of it fast. The monstrous image disposed of, we had only one room left in the hall, the one into which the alien monster had gone. Two of us stood next to the door, our plasma guns held ready, as we pushed the door open and ducked behind Tello's shield. We waved our flashlights, which were helpfully incorporated into the suits, around the darkened storage space. At first we didn't see anything, until Critical's light struck something that glistened like oil. He followed it with the beam and settled on the black carapace of a horrible creature, with an elongated, ovoid head perched in the far corner. It hissed at us, a small second mouth emerging from its gullet to echo the gesture, and we all raised our guns. Will our heroes survive their encounter with this monster? What other horrors will they find on the ship? Can the technocracy be trusted? Find out in the next Mage Storytime.